So what we're beginning to understand then about good teaching is that what makes a good teacher really comes down to the question of how a person has learned to use his self or herself. How have you learned to use this person who you are? And what we now understand about becoming a teacher then is that it is not a question of learning how to teach, it's a question of becoming a teacher, and that's a very different question. See, in the medical profession, we don't say, she's learning how to doctor. See? We say, she's becoming a physician. And in the legal profession, we don't say, he's learning how to law. See? We say, he's becoming a lawyer. In the same way, in becoming a teacher, we don't say, we ought not to say, he's learning how to teach, but he's becoming a teacher, and that's a very different kind of process. And what that comes down to, fundamentally, in the final analysis, what makes a good teacher is a question of the teacher's beliefs. Because you see, your beliefs determine how you behave. And how you behave as a teacher is going to be fundamentally affected by the nature of the beliefs that produce your behavior. Let me give you an illustration of that. See, each of us behaves in terms of his beliefs. In the last election, for example, those of us who thought, the Republicans would save us and the Democrats would ruin us voted for the Republicans. And those who thought that the Democrats would save us and the Republicans would ruin us voted for the Democrats. Everybody behaved according to his beliefs. And the only person in this room who voted according to the facts was me. A fact is what you believe is so. Now, all of us behave in terms of our beliefs, and the question of becoming a teacher, then, is a question of developing a system of beliefs, developing a way of looking at yourself and looking at kids and looking at the classroom and looking at the problem of education and discovering the answers that are workable and satisfying for you. Let me give you an illustration of how important this question of beliefs is from an illustration that happened in one of the outskirts of Atlanta. In one of the suburbs of Atlanta, there was a young woman teaching first grade who had a beautiful head of blonde hair that she was accustomed to wearing in a ponytail that hung down to the middle of her back. Well, this first grade teacher wore her hair that way for the first 3 days of the new school year. And then on Thursday, she decided to do it all up in a bun on top of her head, And one of the little boys in her first grade came and looked in the room, and he didn't recognize his teacher. That happens when a woman changes her hairdo, she looks so different. And so the bell rang, and this little boy stood out in the hall, bewildered, and he began to cry. And a supervisor came along and said to him, "What's the trouble?" And he said, "I can't find my teacher." So she said, "Well, what's your teacher's name?" Well, he didn't know, So she said, "Well, what room are you in?" Well, he didn't know that either. He looked in there and it was the wrong place. So she said, "Well, come on, let's see if we can find her." And they started down the hall, opening one door after another, until finally they came to the room where this young woman was teaching. And as they opened the door and stood there in the doorway, the little boy and the supervisor, the teacher turned and saw them, and she said, "Why, Joey," she said, "it's so good to see you. We've been wondering where you were." She said, "Come on in. We've missed you so." And the little boy pulled out of the supervisor's hands, threw himself into the teacher's arms. She gave him a hug, patted him on the fanny, and he ran down to his seat. Now the supervisor who was telling me this story said to me, "Art," she said, "I said a prayer for that teacher. She knew what was important. She thought little boys were important, see? And that's why she behaved the way she did." Well, the supervisor and I were, when she told me this story, we're riding along in a car at the time, and we started to play a game. We said, suppose she hadn't thought little boys were important. Suppose she thought supervisors were important. What then? Well, then she would have said, why, good morning, Miss Brown. It's so good to see you. We've been hoping you would come and see us, haven't we, boys and girls? And the little boy would have been ignored, Or she might have thought, that the lesson was important. And in that case, she might have said, Joey, for heaven's sakes, where have you been? You're already 2 pages behind. Come in here and get to work. Or she might have thought the discipline was important, And in that case, she might have said, Joey, very well when you're late, you must go down to the office and get a permit and run right on down and get it. But she didn't. She thought little boys were important, see? And she behaved in terms of what she believed was important. Now that is true of all of us. We all behave in terms of what we believe is important. And becoming a teacher is in very large measure a question of discovering what is important for you as a teacher, for the profession, for our society,